panel. Well, right now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our morning speaker who's going to wake you up if you're not woken up already. Jonah Goldberg guides you to appreciate the essential nature of politics by examining the underpinnings of liberal and conservative ideologies, economic policy, and the changing role of modern-day media. As senior editor of the National Review, Jonah firmly established himself as a prominent analyst with the publication of 2 New York Times best-selling books, including Liberal Fascism, The Secret History of the American Left from Mussolini to the Politics of Meaning. Named one of the top 50 political commentators in America by The Atlantic, Jonah's informed and thoughtful perspectives spark indispensable dialogue and debate. Whether discussing the intellectual history of the left or the hazards posed by political cliches, he scrutinizes prevailing opinions and generates new insights. As Jonah regales listeners with his trademark passion and humor, listeners come to recognize the power of ideas to shape a movement as well as individual beliefs. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Jonah Goldberg.
Well, you'll be glad to know I will not be doing any slides or PowerPoint. I agree with Lord Acton that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So that was a very generous intro, but as a point of personal and professional privilege, I have to bring up something that was left out. I'm a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and you don't need to know that, but the highlight of my career was that when the LA Times picked me up as a columnist, Barbra Streisand publicly canceled her subscription in protest. And if I don't bring it up, who will? So anyway, that was again, it was a very nice introduction. I have a problem with this brings humor and insight thing, which people always say, because I'm one of the, like 6 conservatives who knows how to crack a joke. You know, it always makes me feel, it's a kind of a tough balance, right, to be insightful and funny, and it makes me feel like the guy who wants to be both a veterinarian and a taxidermist, because, you know, that way you can get your dog back no matter what. I should also say, so I was out probably a little too late with Steve Hayes last night, who's a very good friend of mine, and he'll be speaking to you in a little bit. And I want to, one of the worst things you can, and Steve's great, but one of the worst things you can have in an audience is to have the audience have too high expectations. And I want to do him a favor right now and just tell you he's going to be awful. He's just going to stink up the room, so that way we'll get you back down to a proper role. So anyway, that is if he shows up at all. Last I saw him, it was in the French Quarter, and the last thing I said to him is like, Steve, man, we got to go. And I'm pretty sure that's a dude, but anyway, let's move on and get to the real stuff. I don't have that much time, so as Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. So one of my favorite stories is a story of a medical school professor who wanted to just see if if the students had done the required reading the night before. So he walks into one of those, you know, one of those big auditorium classrooms where the kids are stacked up all the way to the ceiling, and he just decides to start with an opening question, and he says, what organ of the human body, when properly stimulated, increases 8-fold in size? And then he looks at his little seating chart, and he picks a very prim and proper young lady in the back, and he says, Miss Jones. Miss Jones starts to blush. She starts to squirm in her seat. She's, Professor, I couldn't say. I couldn't answer a question like that. I'm sorry, I can't. And the professor goes, okay, Mr. Smith, and he points at a smart aleck in the front. And Mr. Smith says, the pupil of the human eye when it goes from light to dark. And the professor says, that is correct. Now, Ms. Jones, I have 3 things to say to you. 1, you didn't do your homework. 2, you have a filthy mind. And 3, you are destined to live a life of unfulfilled expectations. So that's sort of where I've been for quite a while now. And before I get into the politics stuff, I should, as a journalist, do some of this full disclosure thing and disclose fully some stuff I'm supposed to disclose. So the first thing I should say, if you didn't know, is that Donald Trump was not my first choice in the Republican primaries. Was not my second choice in the Republican primaries. Wasn't my third choice in the Republican primaries. He sort of tied with George Pataki in my order of things. And I was a big critic of Donald Trump going back to 2012, back when he was still a Democrat. And so the 2016 whole election cycle was pretty rough on me. I've been in conservatism my whole life, worked for National Review. I was raised conservative on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So we were basically like Christians in ancient Rome. You know, you'd meet another conservative in Central Park and you'd draw a little C in the dirt, you know, and I'll meet you in the catacombs under Zabars. So, I mean, I've been a conservative for a very long time, and 2016 had me searching Amazon for deals on hemlock. And so I was critical of Donald Trump, and I should be very clear, just so you guys know where I'm coming from. He was very critical of me. We got into big Twitter fights in the summer of 2015 and early 2016. And at one point, he was being interviewed by NBC News, and the reporter read him something I had written. And President Trump, well, then Donald Trump, said, I've built these incredible businesses. I went to the best schools. I mean, I'm sure you've never heard him say anything like this before. And I have to take this from this guy, Jonah Goldberg, who doesn't even know how to buy pants. And I thought it was a funny line. I'll grant him that. But to this day, I mean, I have teams of interns at the American Enterprise Institute working around the clock trying to figure out what that means. Because while on the one hand, if I were doing a job interview, you know, you're supposed to talk about your strengths, I wouldn't lead with my pants buying ability. I wouldn't be like, you know, what do you bring to this organization? Well, I'm great at buying pants. But I do know how to buy them. You know, it's not like my wife gets calls from the manager of Home Depot saying, I'm sorry, Ms. Goldberg, but we found your husband in the power tool section again trying to buy pants. So, but anyway, so I am not, I was fairly called a never Trumper back then. I am not a never Trumper now, in part because never Trump is over. The whole point about never Trump, at least for me, was that I wouldn't endorse him and I wouldn't vote for him. I certainly wouldn't vote for Hillary. But I live in Washington, D.C. My vote has never mattered. And if I lived in a swing state, I probably would have voted for him because at that point, you have to make the choice of what is the better option. And I think still to this day that Donald Trump was the better option. But what I'm not going to do, because my job is to tell the truth as I see it, and what I'm not going to do is lie. And I've been fighting for conservatism my entire adult life. I was critical of George Bush when he was, I thought, you know, I used to say when George Bush was president, he was spending money like a pimp with a week to live. And then Obama came in and started spending even more money, but that line would have gotten me in trouble about Obama, so I just sort of dropped it. The guy is president of the United States, and you have to give him a shot, and you want, as a conservative, I want him to succeed, and I want him to succeed as a conservative president. So I'm also not a member of the resistance. You know, this is the left-wing thing that basically says we have to oppose him in every single thing that he does. I think that's all very silly. I mean, their arguments ultimately boil down to Donald Trump put salt on his French fries. Hitler put salt on his French fries. You know, it's a very silly sort of thing. And I can tell you right now, particularly as an intellectual historian of fascism in the 20th century, Donald Trump is not Hitler. Hitler, for one thing, could have gotten Obamacare repealed, right? I mean, it's just that it's a different thing. So there have been, you know, the presidency has been a mixed bag. I think that's fair. But there have been some great, by my lights, great parts about it. Neil Gorsuch is fantastic. I think that there is an irony to all the people, all the Bannon types, and I've known Steve Bannon for a long time. I'm not a huge fan anymore. But all the Bannon types who say that you got to get rid of McConnell, Senator McConnell, it's worth just sort of pointing out, is the reason why we have Gorsuch on the court every bit as much, if not more so, than Donald Trump. What McConnell did for a year and not even considering Barack Obama's appointment or nomination of Merrick Garland, he took an enormous amount of heat on that. And then he got the Gorsuch nomination through the Senate, which was no easy task with only 52 senators. But Gorsuch is fantastic. A lot of the deregulation stuff is great. I think it's always a little dicey when presidents of any party claim that they're responsible for the booming stock market. But I think Trump has a better claim than a lot of presidents typically do, because so much of this stuff has to do with the idea of tax reform and the deregulatory stuff and opening up our energy markets and natural resources, which I think is all fantastic. Unwinding a lot of Obama's executive orders is a real accomplishment. Most of the cabinet is really good. I mean, I think there are some weak spots there, but we don't need to get too deep in the weeds there. Oh, and I should also fully disclose, which is a little awkward given my tensions with the president, my wife works for the administration. That's not awkward at all. She's Nikki Haley's chief speechwriter. So anyway, on trade, I think he's wrong. I'm a free trader. I have no problem whatsoever with criticizing NAFTA and some of these other deals, and if we can get better deals, that's fine. But I just simply think that the idea that free trade or increased trade is bad for America is just simply wrong. And we can talk about that if you like. But anyway, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds and the sort of contemporary Trump administration stuff, because I think that's what Steve is supposed to talk about if he's not handcuffed to a towel rack in some motel. So let me talk a little bit about conservatism. Conservatism, it's kind of weird, right? We all think of conservatism as this ideology that is sort of dedicated to the past, believes in tradition, and yet, in many ways, American conservatism is the most recent popular ideology in America. Libertarianism has been around much longer. You know, that's basically classical liberalism. Goes back to the Enlightenment, at least, as a tradition going through Herbert Spencer and whatnot. Socialism has a really long history, predates Marx by a long way. And it's also kind of interesting that when you think about it, conservatism is different than all other ideologies except for radicalism. A political scientist named Samuel Huntington wrote about this in the 1950s. Conservatism is entirely contextual. Used to drive my dad, who was a passionate anti-communist, nuts when the nightly news would refer to the conservatives in the Politburo in Moscow. And what they meant by that was doctrinaire Bolsheviks, right? Very different. A conservative in the Soviet Union, a conservative in France, these people believe very different things than what a conservative in America does. It all depends on what you want to conserve. And in America, as Friedrich Hayek, one of my favorite philosophers, would point out, America is the only country in the world where if you call yourself a conservative, you're still on the side of liberty. Because what you're trying to conserve are the principles and doctrines that emerge out of the American founding. This idea of limited government, this idea that comes out of John Locke, which says we are citizens, not subjects. Our rights are prior to the state. They're given to us by God, not by government. The fruits of our labor belong to us. And that the individual is sovereign, that we are captains of ourselves, right? This is the sort of fundamental creed of Americanism, and that's what conservatives in America tend to want to conserve. It's certainly what I want to conserve. And at the heart of conservatism, I would argue, is gratitude. To be simply grateful for the amazing things that this country has given us. There's an amazing prosperity, the amount of liberty that it has given us. And you can only, without gratitude, you don't know what to conserve. And so for me, that's where conservatism starts, is gratitude, which is a kind of patriotism, which says this country is great and I love it, and there are things about it that I want to hand on to my kids. Because one of the central insights of conservatism is that human nature has no history. Every generation, we have to start the process over again. And, you know, as Hannah Arendt once said, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And anybody who's had kids understands this, that when kids come into this world, when babies come into this world, they have some, built-in software, but they need a lot of updates before they're ready to be called citizens or civilized creatures and not barbarians. So anyway, part of the reason why conservatism was invented essentially in the 1940s and 1950s by people like my old boss, William F. Buckley, is that that a lot of the things that defined what it meant to be an American were on their last legs. In the 18th and 19th centuries, you didn't need conservatism because whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, you still basically believed in the ideas that came out of the American Revolution to one extent or another. Different concepts divided people, slavery, not slavery, and all that kind of stuff. But this idea of preserving the Bill of Rights, of free markets, of free trade, at least internally in the United States or outside, fights over the tariff, these kinds of things were all done within the context of we're all Americans, we all have this one tradition that we're trying to preserve, we're just going to argue about how best to do that. But then with the progressive era and the rise of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of people, a bunch of libertarians, a bunch of traditionalists who said, the only way we're going to beat an ideology is with an ideology. And they created this thing called conservatism, which really, small c conservatism has existed for all of human history, but I'm talking about ideological conservatism, was really a project that begins a little more than a half century ago. And that's the project that I absolutely love. And it's one of the reasons why I had a problem with Donald Trump. Donald Trump, unless it's put in a prompter, doesn't talk about freedom. He doesn't talk about liberty. He doesn't talk about limited government. He talks about strength and will and himself a lot. And he admitted that conservatism was sat on him very lightly. He brags about how he's flexible and he's a pragmatist and he just wants wins and all the rest. I want wins too, but winning absent a context is not an ideology. It is not an ideal that I can subscribe to. I want wins in the right context, which is wins for America and wins for conservatism. But I don't want to get too much more deeply into Donald Trump. Instead, I want to sort of talk a little bit about why he won and why I think conservatism got itself into the mess that it did. There are lots of reasons to talk, there are lots of explanations about why Trump won. It's been almost a year since the election, so we don't have to dwell on it. There was all the free media, there was his star power, there was a 16-man primary, which made it, easy to get a plurality. But one of the reasons I think that is worth focusing on is that conservatism had gotten itself into a deep, deep rut. In my line of work, being a sort of conservative pundit, I'm on Fox News, although not that much these days for reasons you can probably guess. You can make a pretty nice living only talking to audiences that already agree with you. And that same holds true for politicians, where because of the nature of the primary system, both for Congress and the Senate, but also the presidency, you end up talking to audiences that already agree with you. And when you talk to audiences that already agree with you, the imperative is no longer persuasion. It's purity. It's arguing that I'm more pure, I'm more dedicated, I'm going to fight more for these things than for that guy, than that guy will. And there's a place for that in politics, but ultimately, if you go back to Aristotle, what politics is really about is persuasion. It's convincing people in one coalition that their interests will be better served if they join your coalition. And I remember during the government shutdown, I'm friends, or at least I used to be, with Ted Cruz. I respect Ted Cruz. People who say that Ted Cruz is this, horrible Al Gore-like android and all that, it's not true. He's actually, of senators out there, there are a lot of other senators I would much less want to have a beer with than Ted Cruz. But Ted also is he's an odd duck. And so I remember during the government shutdown a few years ago, he was going around saying, everywhere I go, I talk to audiences that want to get rid of Obamacare. It's like, yeah, I would think so. If all I did was go around giving talks to Tea Party chapters in places like Abilene, Texas, I would expect that that's what the audience would want, right? It kind of reminds me of how Richard Nixon was once asked if he thought overpopulation was a real problem. And he says, of course overpopulation is a real problem. I mean, everywhere I go, I see huge crowds. Maybe that has to do with the fact you're president of the United States. So in comes Donald Trump. And he comes in like Godzilla and just sort of stomps around. And people think I'm being ad hominem, but I'm really not. I'm actually a very close student of the entire Godzilla genre. I love those movies. And if you've ever watched them, you'll know that one of the sub-themes, not in all 40 of them, but in a lot of them, is Godzilla comes around, and the hapless Japanese army always has this idea, sort of like in Jaws 2, where they're going to lure Godzilla in and like get him to bite the electrical cables, and that will kill him, right? And so then Godzilla comes out, and they're flashing lights from the Japanese soldiers, and Godzilla comes down and bites the electrical cables, and it makes him stronger. And that's what happened with Trump, right? He kept saying things that everybody in Washington thought were going to destroy his presidency. You know, all these cliches about the third rail of American politics, you touch it and you die, right? So he talks about all sorts of stuff. You know, you don't say those words out loud. And he does it, and he gets stronger. You know, the fins on his back glow, and and we're all like, how is this happening? And one of the reasons why it happened is that people were so sick of hearing politicians say things that seem like they came out of a focus group. And say what you love them or hate them. When you listen to Donald Trump, no one thinks these things were tested in a focus group. And there's another part of persuasion which I skipped, which I need to sort of point out. When you get to this thing where everything's about purity and principles, and look, I love these principles, dedicating my life to these principles. People talk about, the Republican primaries had sort of become like like a C-SPAN version of Spartacus, where everybody's like shouting, "I'm Ronald Reagan," "No, I'm Ronald Reagan," right? And don't get me wrong, look, love Ronald Reagan. What has two thumbs and thinks Reagan is awesome? This guy. But I think Ronald Reagan was put on this planet to do two things, chew gum and kick ass, and he ran out of gum in like 1976. But what people sort of forgot is that what made Reagan a great politician and an effective conservative president was that he was a great politician. And what made him a great politician was that he understood the importance of telling stories. The human brain is wired to understand everything through stories. Written language enters, the human evolutionary, story very late, 10,000, 8,000 years ago, something like that. Every other piece of knowledge was told through stories, remembered through stories. The Bible is many wonderful things, but at the textual level, it's a bunch of stories. Every lesson, every single important lesson of your life has a story attached to it. And Reagan understood that. And he told stories in a way that got people onto his side. There's a great story about how George Shultz, who was one of his cabinet secretaries, he had like 4 different positions, came to Reagan one day and said, "I would love for you to look at this speech. It's really important." And Reagan says, "Sure." And he looks at it, and he says, "Look, this is a really good speech. It's not a speech I would give, but it's a really good speech." And Schultz is like, "Well, what do you mean?" And he says, "Well, here's what I would do. I would go, point, story." And he just writes story every third paragraph in the thing, because that's how, and there's now an incredible amount of brain science that corroborates this. So this is how we understand things. Our brains lock onto stories in a way that we don't with facts. And I won't say that Donald Trump is a great storyteller, but he has a story that people locked into. And the Make America Great Again stuff worked on that level. He also benefited enormously because he ran against Hillary Clinton. And, Hillary Clinton, people always thought that there was this sort of transitive property in politics, that because Bill Clinton was this fantastic extemporaneous talker, that somehow it would transfer to Hillary Clinton. I mean, Bill Clinton was an amazing politician. I'm not a big fan, but he was an amazing politician. You could literally pull him off an intern, slap him with a fish, and say, "Give me 45 minutes on intellectual property rights in the third world." And he would say, "I've got 5 things to say to you today," right? And he could just do that, right? Hillary Clinton's idea of like sort of extemporaneous, off-the-cuff remarks was leaping from her prepared remarks to her prepared note cards. And she came across as the woman who tells you there's no eating in the library. And no one wanted to know how that story ended. Everybody was sort of fascinated. Where you thought Donald Trump was Rodney Dangerfield or Napoleon, you're like, I gotta see how this thing ends, right? And that helped him enormously. But what I worry about now is what this is doing to conservatism. Because I've long argued, I hated all that talk in the election about how America was one election away from being over. I think Sean Hannity said that 45 million times. And the whole point of this country is that if we're just one election away from being over, we're already over. Because politics and the government in Washington are not supposed to matter that much to us. And I think the government in Washington matters way too much to us, and a lot of the stuff that Trump is doing or allowing his appointees to do in terms of sending power back to the states is very good. I would also love to get some buy-in from the left, right? It's amazing when conservatives talk about states' rights and federalism and local authority, mediating institutions and all that kind of stuff, all the left hears is, oh, so you want racism back, or you want slavery back. But now California wants to secede, and no one's saying, oh, so you want to have slavery? You're for Jim Crow now? I mean, the whole point is there are reasons to be in favor of sending stuff back to the states that have nothing to do with wins for conservatives or wins for liberals. All the important decisions in life are made much closer to home. If we push democracy down to the most local level possible, we'll get better results and more people will be able to live the way they want to live. And it'll be a more interesting country to drive across. And when I talk to college students, left-wing college students, about all this kind of stuff, I'm like, you want to buy, these weird craft beers that the FDA says you can't have. Don't you think you can be your own judge on this? Or don't you think the Oregon Health Service can make this determination without being second-guessed by Washington? Or, don't you think, when you talk to people in Washington State, say, really the FDA has to approve, can ban you from buying stinky cheese that tastes like death because it's not properly pasteurized? Push as many of these decisions down to the most local level possible and we'll make people more happy. And all that stuff is great. But what worries me about Trump and the place that we are in now is that conservatism is now being defined simply as whether or not you think Trump is awesome or not. And I'll give you an example. All this fight about Mitch McConnell and Ben Sasse and Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, these guys who are supposedly not supporting the Trump agenda, well, I hear constantly, I had Ben Sasse on I have a podcast and I had him on recently, and people didn't like that he said anything critical of Donald Trump or the Senate candidate Roy Moore. So people are coming at me from all sides saying he's a Democrat, he's a lefty, he's a lib, he should join the Democrats if he doesn't like Trump, blah, 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 blah. So Ben Sasse has, from the American Conservative Union, a 100% conservative score for the last 3 years. He is the third, at least the third most conservative senator in the Senate by voting record. Bob Corker voted with Donald Trump 90% of the time, according to the only real accounting of how this works, right? Mitch McConnell has voted with Trump 96.6% of the time. Meanwhile, Rand Paul, who has a lot of good things going for him, and I agree with him on a lot of issues, at least in theory, has done more to undermine Donald Trump's major big-ticket items in the Senate than almost any other figure. Whichever course of repeal and replace looked like it was going to work, that was the one that he came out against, saying it's not good enough. And then he would recommend some other course, and when they started to pursue that course, he would switch to the other position. And it's part because in Kentucky, Obamacare, with their version of Obamacare, is really popular. And so this is a classic sort of Paulist technique of making the perfect the enemy of the good when it suits your purposes. And that's fine. That's just politics. I'm not condemning them for it. The problem is the people who are attacking Ben Sasse and Mitch McConnell and these guys, they're not attacking them based on the substance of their positions. It's all about whether or not whether they bent the knee and sucked up enough and did the full Mike Pence for Donald Trump. And the full Mike Pence is where you have to say, at home I have a Mike Pence bingo card, and phrases like broad-shouldered leadership, you have to check them off at any Mike Pence speech. And I like Mike Pence, he's a good guy. But I don't need politicians to be talking about how under Comrade Trump, the wheat harvests east of the Urals will be greater than ever before, right? There should be a little more honesty in all of these kinds of things. But that's where we are now, is that if you're critical of Donald Trump, if you're skeptical of Donald Trump, that defines you as no longer a conservative. And that's nuts. Because conservatism, to me, is fundamentally only about two things. The importance of ideas, this idea that we are in an enlightened-based society and that we can communicate and persuade people through reason and facts, that ideas matter, and the importance of character, that your personal integrity, what you do, how you do it, is important, and that the Founding Fathers didn't believe the system could work without a virtuous people. They thought it would all fall apart. And what conservatives believe is these two things are sort of define at the metaphysical level what conservatism is. At National Review, we have this thing called fusionism, which says that combines both sort of libertarianism and traditionalism. And it's basically the argument goes that you cannot compel virtue, that a virtuous society must be a free society, because if you're forced to do something, then you're not really being virtuous. If I hold a gun to your head and have you go walk an old lady across the street, first of all, I'm doing something bad, but you're not going to get any credit because I had to point a gun at you to help a little old lady. You have to choose to do these things. So a free society, a virtuous society, has to be a free society. And if you go back and you look at the founders, the whole point was to be skeptical about leaders and not get caught up in personality cults. And I had a huge problem. I mean, I thought the personality cults around Barack Obama were extremely creepy. I remember when Demi Moore put out that video where she says, "I pledge allegiance to our president." And that's the kind of thing that would have Thomas Jefferson twirling in his grave, right? I mean, that's not what we do in this country. We don't pledge allegiance to people. We pledge allegiance to the Constitution. We pledge allegiance to certain timeless ideas about human liberty. And I find that I personally, and I'm sorry I'm drinking so much, I smoked an enormous amount of pot before I got here, and I get this crazy dry mouth. Sorry about that. Anyway, as James Madison said, look, the truth is that all men having power ought to be mistrusted. When Bill Rusher, who used to be the publisher of National Review and was a lifelong friend of Bill Buckley's, would sort of bring in, have lunch for the first time with young writers at National Review, he would always give them one central piece of advice. And the advice was, politicians will always disappoint you. And it's not because politicians are necessarily bad, although some of them are terrible. It's because the incentive structure for politicians is just different than the incentive structure for glassy-eyed, young, ideologically committed 20-something conservatives. And that's always going to be true, because politicians at the end of the day are people, and people are built out of the crooked timber of humanity, and they have interests that are divergent. And the whole point of this country, from the beginning, was to not put our faith in kings and monarchs, whether on the left or the right or whatever concept that you want to put in. And that is what I'm sort of fighting for at this point, is that whether you love Trump or hate him, and whether you think what he's doing is good or bad, and I think it's a mixed bag, I think what's important is sticking by these principles and saying the truth as I see them. And if these principles were right when Barack Obama was president and when George Bush was president, I don't think they become wrong just in case they become inconvenient to Donald Trump. And while I'd never believe that we are only one election away from oblivion, I do think that if the conservative movement which I, in this sense, include libertarians most emphatically, if we lose the freedom movement in this country, if we lose the ideological movement that says the Constitution matters, limited government matters, that we are citizens, not subjects, that the fruits of our labors belong to us, that the individual is sovereign, if we lose the conservative movement, which upholds or is supposed to uphold these things, then we got real problems. Because then we basically have two parties competing for who can be more populist, who can promise their coalition all the goodies and design our politics to punish the other people. And Barack Obama did a lot of that. Donald Trump is doing it, and it is sort of turning it up to 11. But he's not responsible for it. These things were in our politics for a while. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons, which my wife actually got me as a birthday present because I liked it so much, she had it blown up and framed, has two dogs drinking martinis at a bar in New York wearing pinstripe suits. And one dog says to the other, you know, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail. And that's sort of where we are politically now, right? It has to be, it can't just be good for us. It's got to, you know, we have to taste their delicious tears too. And I do a lot of that stuff. You know, I've been a right-winger for a long time. If I'm talking to a purely right-wing audience, I can dole out the red meat like it's an abattoir. But we have to sort of stand for something a little higher and better than that when our politics are becoming so degraded. For the first time in American history, your political orientation is more predictive of your behavior than race, religion, or ethnicity. That's bananas. But what we're doing is we're turning politics into a kind of tribalism, as a kind of identity. And I'm going to close on this sort of simple point. The Democrats have been better at telling this story for a very long time, this idea that the government can love you, that the government can give you meaning. For reasons largely having to do with original sin, I attended the Democratic Convention in 2012, and the opening video of the Democratic Convention in 2012 had the line, "Government is the one thing we all belong to." Now, as sort of a Tea Party-ish kind of guy, that makes me want to flip the safety on my rifle, right? Because again, the whole point is we are citizens, not subject. Government works for us. We don't work for it. But the reality is that I'm not the person, shockingly enough, that the opening video of the Democratic Convention is aimed at. It's aimed at people who hear government is the one thing we can all belong to. People want to feel like they're part of something. And as civil society breaks down, as families break down, as local communities break down, as churches and religion in general have less hold over people's lives, our desire to belong to something larger than ourselves doesn't go away. And politicians in Washington come along and say, there's government, you can belong to that. I don't know how many of you guys remember the Life of Julia, which is the creepiest PowerPoint presentation in American history. It was this slideshow that the Obama campaign put out in 2012 about this fictional woman named Julia. And it covered her entire life. And it was literally cradle-to-grave welfare state stuff. Each frame of this entire sort of comic book panel began with the words, under President Obama, Julia gets a Pell Grant, or Julia gets a small business loan, or Julia gets, you know, health care or free birth control or whatever it is. Every single panel. It goes out to like 2070. So basically Obama in this vision is president for life. And the single creepiest sentence I think ever uttered in American politics was, under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child. You know, and that just makes me feel unsafe, you know. And but this is a vision that Democrats or that progressives have been putting forward since at least, you know, Woodrow Wilson, is this idea that there's the government and the individual and nothing in between. And that's not true. Most of the meaning we get in our lives comes from other places. It comes from church and work and friends and community and faith. There are only 5 sources of actual happiness that psychologists have identified. And they are faith, experience, community, genes, because some people are just miserable bastards, and this thing called earned success. And what earned success is, it's not about money. It can be about money for some people, but what earned success really is this feeling that you have made a contribution, that you've done something important, that you're respected and needed by other people. So a stay-at-home mom can have earned success. A soccer coach can have earned success. A priest can have earned success. It's not about money. It's about self-worth. And the thing is, the federal government can do a lot to improve your net worth. It can do literally nothing to improve your self-worth. That has to come from someplace else. It has to come from being needed. It has to come from freedom. Because whenever government tries to sort of impose meaning on people, that is the beginning of tyranny and oppression. And it doesn't matter from what ideological direction it comes from. And so I'm going to close on this point because partly because my next book, I've been working on a book for about 3 years called The Suicide of the West. I've been sort of like Howard Hughes with Kleenex boxes on my feet in my basement. And just the other day, I finally cut my 9-inch long fingernails. And one of the things I've decided, or I argue, is that left and right concepts which I spent years arguing about and studying and I think have meaning in lots of contexts, in the big picture of things, they are almost irrelevant. Because liberal democratic capitalism, this thing that comes basically out of the Lockean Revolution and in the American Revolution, is simply the best and only modern satisfactory system for how to organize a society. We are at the summit of human accomplishment when it comes to organizing our politics. And we can have changes, but more government, less government, we can have those arguments, that's fine. But as Calvin Coolidge said in his speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, there is something restful about the Declaration of Independence. Because if our rights come from God and are inalienable, that is final. If government is formed as a servant of the people, that is final. There's no progress beyond that. There's only going backward. And whether you want to talk about fascism or progressivism or Nazism or communism, fine, I can have those conversations. But they are all different kinds of tribalism that want to yank us out of this amazing miracle that we stumbled into. And so when you're on the top of a mountain and you want to go left or you want to go right, we can have those arguments. But in reality, when you're at the top of the mountain, whether you go left or you go right, ultimately you're only going either down or backwards because you can't go any higher than what we got. And we should be grateful for it. Because, everyone knows the hockey stick about global warming and, this famous thing that got lots of people in trouble. The far more interesting hockey stick is the one that shows that for 250,000 years, human beings everywhere in the world in every age lived on $3 a day or less on average. Ancient China, ancient Rome, Aztecs, doesn't matter. That was true for 250,000 years. It's like this. Every now and then you get a little blip, and then the logic of Malthusianism would bite you in the ass and would go back down and regress to the mean. And then starting around 1650, 700, it starts to go like this. And it's been going like this ever since. We have been climbing up in terms of expanding human prosperity all around the world. And it only happened for one reason, because of capitalism, liberal democratic capitalism. This idea that the individual that is sovereign, that innovation is good, that freedom to trade and to enrich yourself is also enriching of others. And capitalism is the single greatest anti-poverty program ever created. It is, in fact, the only anti-poverty program ever created. People always like to ask, why is there poverty? You have to be too stupid to be a spell checker at an M&M factory to ask this question, right? We know why there's poverty. Poverty is the factory preset of the human condition. As an individual and as a species, every single human being is born naked, penniless, and ignorant. The only interesting question is, why is there wealth? And there's only one answer. And it's this amazing thing that started in England and was really sort of codified in America and has spread around the world. We've seen more, thanks to markets, free markets, or even partially free markets, but markets, thanks to capitalism. In the last 40 years, we've seen the greatest single reduction in poverty in all of human history, bar none. Billions of people have been lifted out of poverty thanks to markets, thanks to capitalism. And the problem is that we're not grateful for it. And instead we keep thinking, oh, there must be a better way. There's not a better way. And so you get into this thing where we take everything for granted. And what I ask you to do, I really couldn't give a rat's ass whether you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump or Republican or Democrat. That's all fine. But be grateful for this country. Be grateful for this amazing revolution that took us out of the jungle and made people prosperous and free for the first time in all of human history. And if you don't defend it, you're going to lose it. Because the second law of thermodynamics says if you don't take care of something, if you don't maintain something, it basically regresses back into nature. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. What we have is unnatural, and it's special. And you should be grateful for it. You should teach your kids to be grateful for it. Everybody in this room is descended from poor people. Some of you, statistically, most of you, probably one or two generations at most. There may be a spare Rothschild in the back or something. But we are all descended from poor people. And the only thing that made us wealthy is capitalism. And the problem is it doesn't feel like it because it's so good at it, right? Everyone wants to belong to a community. Everyone wants to be part of a communal project. But it is so good at getting people to work together that it's sort of like the old Ivory soap ad. It's 99 and 44/100% pure that you just don't notice it anymore. One of the greatest essays in the history of libertarianism is this essay called I, Pencil, written from the perspective of a pencil. And the pencil says, I'm an Eberhard and Faber #2 pencil. My rubber comes from Indonesia, and my wood comes from Canada, and my paint comes from Delaware, and my zinc comes from Zinkland. I don't know where zinc comes from. You guys probably know where zinc comes from. And he points out, the pencil says, you have all these people speaking different languages, having different religions, living in different countries under different faiths, and that they all work seamlessly together all around the world to produce something for less than a penny a pencil. It's this amazing thing. There was a guy who did an art exhibit in England a few years ago called iToaster, where he made a toaster from scratch. Literally from scratch, like mined the copper, galvanized the rubber. I don't know how you make a toaster, but he did it from scratch. It took him 6 years. Really crappy toaster. Last year, there was a guy who made a chicken sandwich from scratch. I mean, I swear it's not a chicken or egg joke. I guess he got an egg, he raised it into a chicken, he grew some lettuce, he grew with wheat, milled it into flour, blah, blah, blah. It took him like the better part of a year. It cost him $1,500. And you can watch it on YouTube, and he says, it's an okay sandwich. Meanwhile, capitalism is constantly finding ways to put cheese in new places on pizza. I mean, there's amazing things that capitalism does, and it's freedom. So I ask you this, whatever your partisan affiliation or whatever you think about my very strange morning talk, be happy warriors and fight for this system, because it is the good fight. It is the only noble fight around, to be on the side of liberty, on the side of fighting poverty, on the side of letting people live the lives that they want to live and pursue happiness as they want to pursue it. And it's a great and glorious thing, and you should be grateful for it, and you should teach your kids to be grateful for it, because if you don't do that, it's all going to go away, and back to the jungle we go. Thank you all very much.